Hello and welcome. My name is Cathy and I run the Journalism Initiative on Gender-Based Violence here at the Institute for Women's Leadership. The initiative runs workshops and programs with journalists all over the world, promoting ethical and trauma-informed reporting on gender-based violence. But, telling stories ethically and reporting on human rights is not just a job for journalists. I know that some of you are already established or aspiring professionals in PR, marketing, advertising, communications, design, TV, film, politics, or social media. And whatever path your career continues on, telling stories with an ethical and a humane eye will increase the quality of the public debate for everyone, especially if you move into jobs like teaching or law, human rights, or politics. Because how we tell stories shapes the world. And when journalists misreport or fail to cover the real problems of society, we as the voting public, we lack the information that we need to then make informed choices at the ballot box. And the same is especially true when it comes to bad reporting on women, gender, and violence. Shallow or contextless reporting means that we don't have the information to put the pressure on our elected officials and force through more humane policies on gender, on women's rights, on reproductive and sexual rights. And you may think this stuff doesn't matter, but I can give a few examples of reporting that did shift the dial and did have a real world impact. For instance, reporting on the Me Too movement in the US. Key stories on the murder of Dalit H&M factory worker Jayasara Kathy Raval in India, and a groundbreaking investigation into abductions and rapes in the Democratic Republic of Congo. All of these stories led to convictions and/or key policy changes. Jayasara in India, in southern India, was murdered on New Year's Day in 2021 by her male supervisor. And this was after months of sexual harassment. And in the aftermath of the murder, her colleagues reported the endemic sexual harassment to the Guardian newspaper in the UK, where the story was first published in February, a month later. Labour unions were also involved in applying pressure, and a global campaign began called the Justice for Jayasara movement. And that movement forced H&M to agree to new protections against gender-based violence and harassment, and worker-led monitoring of GBV and caste-based discrimination on the shop floor. And these are the places, these are the factories that make the clothes that you or I might wear. So this is real world stuff, and it matters. In 2016, American journalist Lauren Wolfe published a story in The Guardian about a series of rapes in a town in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Her story was based on extensive on-the-ground investigations. Hours after the story was published, arrest warrants were issued for a local MP and 67 of his associates. Later that day, they were in custody. In the months that followed, Lauren published another story about the investigation, where she said she protected the identity of her local sources and allowed the voices of survivors to be heard around the world. And since then, not a single girl in Kavumu has been abducted or raped. And so telling stories humanely means centering survivors, not the perpetrators, and using a trauma-informed approach when interviewing. When telling the stories of survivors ethically, we focus on uplifting ongoing efforts towards justice and redress. And if there are none, then we ask those in power why not. It also means adding the correct context. Sometimes human stories are told in the media for shock value or because they're entertaining or gruesome. This is often true of stories about femicide, trans issues, missing women, and trafficking. When this happens, it encourages the audience to view women and women's issues as fodder for entertainment and spectacle only, instead of sites of potentially transformative social change. And it's not all about trauma-informed interviewing and the survivor-centered approach. It's also about the words you choose when you create your social media posts or company blogs. It's about whose voice you use to tell the stories and whether you choose images that dignify people or humiliate them. So it doesn't just apply to journalists. Creative communication on human rights is also about refusing to use cliches and boring language. We want to surprise our audience and shock them into taking action. Perhaps we can use data and statistics alongside illustration in fresh and informative ways. For an example of this, look to the work of the New York Times contributor Mona Chalabi. She won the Pulitzer Prize last year for her explanatory illustration on women's issues. And she's now busy creating illustrated infographics on media bias in the coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. I recently read an excellent article on Vox.com about sexual violence and the terror group Hamas's use of rape as a weapon of war against Israelis. The article contextualized what happened on October the 7th and gave background details about the use of sexual violence in conflict, its prevalence, how it's underreported and often goes unreported, and then grounded the events in the historical perspective of the ongoing apartheid in Palestine and sexual violence used against Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. I haven't seen anything since or before that was so informative, mature, and unsensational in its handling of a difficult topic. And that's what good journalism does. It informs. It doesn't seek just to entertain. And this story stands in stark contrast to some reporting by the Washington Post and the New York Times. Both newspapers recently published stories on the same issue, full of poorly sourced, graphic, sensationalized details and descriptions. In the case of the New York Times story, the Israeli family of one of the victims who was killed by Hamas later said they felt used and lied to by the reporters. This is what we want to avoid when reporting and writing about sexual violence and gender-based violence. If we don't treat survivors with dignity and write about them with respect, then we have failed. In the case of my book about the crimes committed by ISIS against the Yezidi people in Iraq, called With Ash on Their Faces, I wrote about the way Yezidi women passed down stories of resistance to enslavement during the Armenian genocide 100 years ago, and how their granddaughters used similar strategies of resistance when they were enslaved in ISIS prisons, such as tattooing their forearms with the number of loved ones or sewing messages inside their undergarment. These methods built up a kind of oral feminist refrain of disobedience to violent, misogynistic genocidal attacks that had gone on for hundreds of years by different belligerents. These stories were described by Yezidi women who escaped ISIS, and they had heard the same stories of resistance from their grandmothers when they were children sitting by the fire, and recounted them to me during the 5 years I spent living and working in Iraq. And one of the factors that motivated me to write the book was witnessing how journalists were queuing up to interview Yazidi survivors of ISIS sexual violence. But in their reports, the women were presented only as victims without wishes, desires, thoughts, political visions, or backstories. and I wanted to do something different. I don't know if I was successful, but at least we are here together today to think about how we can try and tell stories differently. So with my initiative, the Journalism Initiative on Gender-Based Violence, I'll be training journalists this year in Nepal and Iraqi Kurdistan. In Iraq, I've co-written a media ethics pact with a Kurdish women's rights organization. The pact is for media organizations covering gender-based violence and lays out basic ethical principles for journalists, as well as enshrining rules and best practices around keeping women journalists safe. Women journalists and media workers globally receive far more harassment for reporting on gender-based violence, both in person and online. Far more harassment than men. But both men and women journalists are not safe in many parts of the world. They can be killed, assassinated, attacked for their reporting on political issues, on corruption, on violence, and particularly on violence against women. And sometimes trying to report on these issues, you're just met with a wall of silence from media organizations. So there are many barriers when it comes to reporting on gender-based violence and doing so safely. But this is not a reason to stay away from difficult topics. It's important to think about how we can keep each other safe and work together to ensure equal rights and equal participation for women in the workplace without fear of harassment. And promoting these standards is a main part of my job with the Institute for Women's Leadership. And my initiative is also working on an academic book with two other Rutgers colleagues and a legal scholar about how common cases of gender-based violence actually do amount to crimes against humanity under international law. Now, this may sound obscure, but if we treat gender-based violence as the emergency it is, rather than as a natural fact of life for women and gender non-conforming people, then we can perhaps change the way people think about gender-based violence and work towards ending it for good. Thank you very much for having me.